Hey everyone, it's Bina 007 and Pat back again for another episode of The Vassals of Kingsgrave, Agatha Christie Reread. We're here today with episode 36. We're talking about Sparkling Cyanide, aka Remembered Death in the US, and it was published in December 1945. Welcome, Pat.
Hi there.
So at this point, Agatha is 55 years old. The eagle-eyed, the eagle-eared amongst you will notice that in our linear reread, we have not covered Death Comes at the End. Partly because it's a slightly weird novel. It is set in ancient Egypt, and partly because I did try reading it again, and I got halfway through. I was trapped in an airplane on the runway in Bordeaux, waiting for King Charles to land. He'd held up all the air traffic. So I had like 2 hours of spare time and a book. And even with that incentive to read it, I found it too boring, and I just ended up just leaving it on the plane for the next reader. So have you ever read Death Comes at the End, Pat?
No, and you're not selling it to me. So, I mean, if watching King Charles's waiting 2 hours to watch King Charles's plane land is more interesting than a book, then I'm sorry. I'm going to check out on that one.
I'm not going to lie. I just did put on like a Formula One podcast and fall asleep and start snoring. It's just, I don't know. And it should be good, right? Because it's not like she wasn't familiar with archaeology. And maybe there are Agatha Christie lovers out there who love that book. And if so, you feel free to come on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord or leave a comment in the YouTube and lobby Pat and I. If you feel that we should give this book a go, let us know. But we are not covering Death Comes at the End. I suppose the more legit reason for not covering it is that the motive, on my part anyway, for the reread was to look at how England was changing over this period that Agatha Christie was writing about. And I guess unless we want to sort of establish what 1940s people thought of ancient Egypt, that wasn't going to really fit the bill either. So,
like, I've not read it, so I don't know. But I do think one of the things I'm enjoying most about the reread is the sort of period nature of this. And I think, Agatha doesn't do it as well as other authors, but she still does capture this class dynamic. And it's quite interesting the way that she plays with it to misdirect us, to play on the biases and prejudices that people have, So that I find quite interesting. And I'm not sure if that would translate as well to the ancient Egypt setting that she will be using. So.
What I found really weird was because she had all these like ancient Egyptian names, which even when you're not reading aloud, but even in your head, you sort of say them as you read, or I do, and I kept tripping up over them. But then the tone was still quite suburban English setting.
Right.
It was very jarring. I tell you what, if you love all the class stuff, have you started reading The Hollow yet? Because that's really fascinating, because a lot of the characters are, I don't know what you call them, leisured class, when they just don't have to work at all. And then one of the characters, Midge, does have to work, and she's a distant cousin. So some of them are very patronizing about, find a better job. And she's like, no, but I have to work. This is a job. It pays me. Like,
just find a better job.
Yeah, and she gets really angry with them because it's like, you've never worked. What the hell do you know?
That's partly what we've got with Sparkling Cyanide as well. And I was almost like asking myself, how much of this was the reality of 1945 England? Because it does seem to me almost to be like sort of like late 20s England.
With debutante balls and
and having this ability to have this leisured, moneyed class,
Although
of
it's
young
new
people.
money, isn't it? I mean, at least George Barton's money is new money, but we can get into it, right? But I think you're right. I think in my head, it felt very 1920s aristocratic debutante ball. I don't know why, but we can get into that. And maybe that was deliberate. It's wartime, so maybe it's deliberate.
Yeah, she'd cast it back to a time when people had that sort of like perceived easier lifestyle. They weren't dealing with death every day.
And rationing. The idea that you could go to a glitzy, ritzy restaurant and order a lavish meal and drink champagne in the middle of wartime rationing.
Being served by Italian waiters.
Yeah, exactly. Who everyone loves. Not patronising at all. Okay, folks, let's remind you that we are going to be spoiler-free until the end credits music, and then spoiler-filled thereafter. And we'll give you a little plot summary before we get into historical context, the characters, adaptations, how it holds up to modern ears and eyes, the social content of the book. So a little bit of plot summary, the book blurb. 1 year earlier, 7 people sat down to dinner at the Luxembourg restaurant, which I think is clearly Café de Paris, right? Rosemary.
I'll bow to your superior knowledge of London restaurants on that.
Okay, well, I think this is, for those of you who know London, I think this is Café de Paris. 1, Rosemary Barton never got up. Instead, she collapsed and died. The coroner ruled her death suicide by poisoning due to post-flu depression. And boy, are we going to get into that. 6 months later, her husband George receives anonymous letters saying that Rosemary was murdered. George investigates and decides to repeat the dinner at the same restaurant with the same guests, plus an actress who looks like his late wife, and who is meant to arrive late and startle the murderer into making a confession. So that's the setup of this novel. It is, in fact, a recycled plot, as Agatha Christie often does. It's the expansion of an Hercule Poirot short story entitled Yellow Iris, which had previously been published in Strand magazine in 1937. It was also published in book form in the UK in Problem at Palenza Bay in 1991, so you can buy it here as a part of a short story collection. So she recasts it here in long form, and it stars Colonel Race instead of Hercule Poirot, which I think is a shame, but we can get into that too. And if you want to see in adaptations, we will talk about the adaptation of this Sparkling Cyanide novel. But there's also, in the first season of the David Suchet Hercule Poirot's, which were all short story adaptations, there is a version of Yellow Iris. So if you want to sort of compare and contrast in audiovisual form, you certainly can. Okay, so had you read this before? What did you think? Is this top tier, Agatha? Second tier? How are you feeling about Sparkling Cyanide? We've decided to do a full pod, so I guess that's suggestive.
Yeah, I hadn't read it before. I had seen the Suchet Yellow Iris. I do remember seeing that.
Okay.
I won't talk about that until the spoiler section. I would put this mid-tier. I think it's probably sort of similar to the one that we've just done previously. It's probably got stuff to commend it. I don't know, maybe I'm getting Christie fatigue and I'm not picking up on some of the stuff that she's doing so well.
We'll have to have a long pause over Christmas and New Year and come back refreshed.
Yeah. It did have stuff to commend it, and like she's done some great misdirects, and it's quite a good plot. But I again, probably like you, I think it suffers for me for not having Poirot or Marple. I do think they bring a level of interest to it that I don't get otherwise. And Colonel Johnny Race is not the most interesting of characters. He is very much like Battle was in the previous book. He's just a plot delivery device, really. So
yeah, I agree. I think he's the real weakness here, and I think, although I do quite like some of the tricksiness of the plot, there is a credibility issue, I think, and whether it would really work that way. We'll get into that in the spoiler section. I also feel there's not a laziness in characterization, because actually I do like the characters here. I think there's some really interesting kind of, the relationships are really strong. And actually, in The Hollow, some of that's echoed, and they're even stronger, I think, in The Hollow.
Yeah, and she's expanded on the love triangle. Like we have like about 8 people involved here, and they all like somebody else.
It's like a love pentangle or something, isn't it?
Yeah. So like we've got Rosemary Barton, who's married to George Barton, and George Barton loves Rosemary, but he's loved by his secretary Ruth Lessing, and then Rosemary likes a politician, Stephen Faraday, and Stephen Faraday's wife is obviously in love with Stephen. And then Rosemary is also liked by Anthony Brown, but he also likes Iris Maule, Rosemary's sister. So we've got like a spider web of relationships here, which it does make it a more interesting read, and certainly like it widens our cast of suspects.
Yeah, I think this for me is one of the books that you read for the characters and not, well, you still read it for the plot, because I think the plot's good. It's by no means Murder in Mesopotamia, but it's a bit more contrived. And I think you're right, there's something slightly unreal about knowing this was published in 45. It doesn't read like a 1945 novel. It's slightly odd. I think to me, I had remembered reading this in my 20s, and I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to, more than I did at that time. But yeah, to me, it's not top tier. But anyway, let's get into it with a bit of historical context. And actually, it's quite a lot of historical context, because as we're skipping over Death Comes at the End, there's a big gap between the previous book that we reviewed in this linear reread and then coming up to the point of publication. And actually big events in the Christie family as we wind down the war. So, historical context since the last book that we covered was published. So, July 1944, at Camp Hood, Texas, future baseball star Jackie Robinson is arrested and later court-martialed for refusing to move to the back of a segregated US Army bus. Just horrible.
Wow.
In Japan, yeah, I know. In Japan, Hideki Tojo resigns as Prime Minister of Japan. So you're seeing, really, by this point, the tide of the war turning. And the Bretton Woods Conference ends with agreements signed to set up the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the International Monetary Fund, which is still influential today.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. This is all becoming now setting up the post-war architecture, even though the war has kind of like a year to run. August 1944, we have the Warsaw Uprising starting. We have IBM dedicating the first program control calculator, the automatic sequence control calculator known best as Harvard Mark I. Kind of exciting. And we have the liberation of Paris as the Battle of Normandy concludes. So Paris is liberated as early as August 1944, which I guess I must have known, but I was still surprised.
And explains how they can be drinking champagne in Luxembourg despite rationing.
Indeed, maybe. And fatefully for the Agatha Christie family, her one daughter, Rosalind Hicks, had gotten married a year and a half prior. She's only 25 and she's now a widow. So she had married Major Hubert de Burgh Pritchard, son of Colonel Herbert Pritchard, in 1940 in Wales. Their only child, Matthew Pritchard, was born in 1943, and her husband dies in this month, August 1944, in the Battle of Normandy when her son's only a year old. So a widow at 25, rather tragic. So
yeah, tragic.
Yeah, really, really horrid. And I guess, in a sense, when you read stuff like that, maybe it makes more sense why Agatha Christie would write something in seemingly a different time, a much more sort of carefree time.
Yes, yeah, definitely a form of escapism, which is understandable.
Absolutely. September 1944, the Dutch famine begins. So those of you with the familiarity of Audrey Hepburn's story will know about that. Staying in the Netherlands, Anne Frank is sent to Auschwitz with her family. And the first V2 rockets land on London. So in the midst of dealing with her daughter's grief, Agatha Christie is now working in a London that's getting bombed with V2 rockets. October 1944, Aachen is the first German city to fall when it's captured by American troops. So we're getting into taking Germany. The war's really taking place at this point. November 44, FDR wins re-election over Republican challenger Thomas E. Dewey. So he's the only president elected to a fourth term in the US. And this is interesting because we discussed it last episode. Laurence Olivier's film Henry V opened in London to huge critical acclaim. First film to be made in Technicolor, which he starred and directed in. And he was saying it's propaganda, basically.
Yes, and positive. I didn't want to be too snippy about it. Like we mentioned it in the last podcast, but I do get the feeling that people like Orwell and Olivier almost felt like they had to do their bit, and so making propaganda was a way that they could do it because, you know, I think Orwell wasn't able to fight on the front. He just wasn't medically well enough to do it, you know, and Olivier, I'm not sure. He's probably more value in making Henry V than he was going over the top or jumping out of a landing craft on the beaches of Normandy. So
I wonder if he would have been too old for conscription as well at that point.
Probably. I'm not sure what age he would have been, but he definitely would have thought he would have been in his 40s at least.
Yeah. And actually, it's in this period, October, November, that Death Comes at the End is published. So that would have been the Christie for Christmas, insofar as people were still doing that. December 44, the British Home Guard is stood down. At that point, the government's saying we no longer think a German invasion is likely. So all of you Dad's Army fans, they were not in uniform to the end of the war, which I did not know. In pop culture sort of information, the film National Velvet is released in the US, bringing a young Elizabeth Taylor to stardom. A US AAF utility aircraft carrying band leader Major Glenn Miller disappears in a heavy fog over the English Channel while flying to Paris, which is a truly tragic waste of talent. Germany begins the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, and the daily newspaper Le Monde begins publication in a liberated Paris, which is wonderful. Still running today as the major newspaper there. And then we enter January 1945, the final year of World War II. January is when Hitler enters his bunker, and when, thank goodness, Auschwitz-Birkenau is liberated by the Soviet Union. So this will be when the world is truly seeing the scale of Auschwitz and realizing what was happening in the Holocaust. February 1945, Raymond L. Liddy, who I had not heard of, he's an American research scientist at Stamford, Connecticut, announces a method of orally administering even the antibiotic penicillin, which, I mean, how profound for humanity. What
Yeah,
an amazing
massive.
thing. Absolutely massive. And then he ballsed it all up by over-prescribing and taking antibiotics. But anyway, that's for another day.
Okay.
And as I said, the war is moving now to post-war settlements. So FDR, Churchill, Stalin hold the Yalta Conference where they're basically carving up Europe. And in Japan, where things are not winding down with such rapidity, we have the Battle of Iwo Jima. So you can all watch the Clint Eastwood film if you want to see that amazingly rendered. March 1945, in the UK, Princess Elizabeth joins the Auxiliary Territorial Service as a truck driver / mechanic in London. We have the bombing of Tokyo, B-29 bombers attacking Tokyo with huge incendiary bombs, basically firebombing, killing 100,000 people. It is the single most destructive conventional air attack of the war. And Adolf Hitler issues the Nero Decree, ordering that all industries, military installations, machine shops, everything has to be destroyed by the Germans to prevent the invaders taking control of it. So really horrible, this final phase of the war.
Yeah, and Hitler really plumbing the depths of insanity as he decides that it's a scorched earth policy. If he can't have it, nobody can. So.
Yeah, if you issue a decree that becomes known as the Nero Decree after the, of a long line of nutty Roman emperors, one of the most nutty, then it's not a good sign, is it? April 45, USA liberates Buchenwald and Dachau concentration camps. The British Canadians liberate Bergen-Belsen. So the full horror of the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis is coming to light now. FDR very tragically dies, and his Veep, Truman, is sworn in as the new US president. Hitler dies in the bunker, and Mussolini is executed and hung by his heels in the public square. So both of the major Axis powers in Europe are now dead. In May 1945, we have the fall of Berlin. Werner von Braun surrenders to the US. We have Victory in Europe Day, which, if you're watching The Crown, you'll see a young Princess Elizabeth and Margaret Rose celebrating Victory in Europe Day by sneaking out of Buckingham Palace to get blitzed in the Ritz. And Lord Haw-Haw, who was a British traitor who broadcast propaganda, pro-German propaganda back to the Brits, is captured. But huge relief all around that war is over in Europe. In June 1945, the UN Charter is signed in San Francisco. All you Star Trek fans, that's why Starfleet is based there. We have the Neumann architecture published, first published description of the logical design of a computer with stored program and instruction data stored in the same address space within the memory. I don't really know what that means. I just read it from Wikipedia, but it's cool.
Yeah, it's a core part of any computer science course that you do. It's sort of like the basic.
Okay.
You do the von Neumann architecture. What's that? It basically means that we've divided the computer up into these different parts. We have a processor and somewhere to store the data and stuff. So
that's cool. Did you realize it was from? Well, I guess if you studied it, that it's from 1945.
I didn't know it was from 1945. So, but yes,
Science.
like we're going through a period, and a lot of it is off the back of Bletchley Park. Where we're making tremendous advances in computer science. All these light bulbs and valve computers that they have, just doing binary and then building upon it to make what we've got now, where we're talking to each other over iPhones while we're searching the internet.
It's kind of amazing, right? I'm always in awe at how early some of these advances were. You just think these people, when you look at a quote-unquote computer and what they were using at Bletchley, which is sort of toggles and switches and little glass bulbs and leads, and it's just, it just blows your mind. It's so impressive.
Yeah, well, it's incredible to think that those are the fundamental building blocks that are still being used in your computers. It's basically just binary. Yeah. It's just switching something on and off.
Yeah, it's very humbling in a way. So we get to July 1945. FDR has sadly already died. Winston Churchill now loses the election in a landslide victory, sweeping Labour into power. I think much of the rest of the world's kind of shocked that the Brits would eject this guy who basically inspired them to win the war, but that's how we do. Moving on to the future, building a Britain fit for heroes.
Yeah, Britain wanted to change, didn't it? They were like,
then as now, my friend, then as now.
Yeah.
So now the focus turns on the war in the Pacific. Truman tells Japan to surrender, and they're like, no, because we want to keep our emperor. And they're like, we really don't want you to keep your emperor, so we want an unconditional surrender. So this now carries on. We have the Trinity test. So if you watch the film Oppenheimer, you can see that reenacted very powerfully. And we also have the Potsdam Conference between the victors, again, to decide how to carve up the spoils. In August 1945, we have the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, incredibly controversial to this day and powerful moments in history. And then, unsurprisingly, very soon after, Japan accepts unconditional surrender. And so in September 1945, you have VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And we have the split occupation of Korea. So now Germany has split occupation and so does Korea, which lasts to this day. October 1945, the Nazi Party is dissolved by the Allies. And this is an interesting pop cultural one. At Gimbel's department store in New York City, the first ballpoint pens go on sale at $12.50 each. I mean, I don't know what that is in modern money, but that's a lot for a big biro, isn't it? But anyway.
That is a lot for a big biro. Sorry, the phone was going there to edit that out. But yes, $12.50. It sounds a substantial amount of money. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, probably easier to buy a fountain pen. November 1945, Charles de Gaulle elected president of France. The Nuremberg war trials begin. And we see the assembly of the world's first general-purpose electronic computer, the ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator Analyzer and Computer. It's completed in the United States. And how big do we think this computer is? It's 1,800 square feet of floor space.
Yeah, massive.
It's basically an apartment.
The only reason it was built in the US because it's the only country big enough to give up that much land to actually develop the thing.
Exactly. And then December 1945, final month of the war year and month of release of this book. Patton dies in a car accident. General Patton. The World Bank is created, still in existence today. Promethium is discovered. And milk is first pasteurized. So all of you drinking milk and not getting sick, there you go. That's when it started being the case. So there's a lot of history there, but thank goodness we're at the end of World War II. Even more, thank goodness we're at the end of the Holocaust. But war brought to conclusion in Japan in horrific circumstances as well, with the dropping of the atomic bomb. So an eventful year, an eventful 18 months for the Christie family with the death of her son-in-law, very tragically, and her daughter widowed. And that brings us to this kind of slightly surreal left turn into a novel that feels very glitzy and ritzy and luxurious by contrast.
Yeah, very sobering. The context summaries, the sort of historical context summaries going forward, I think will be a bit shorter. So.
Yeah, exactly. It will be more pleasant to have less history, put it that way. Or maybe more fun, like pop cultural references that kind of mesh into the kind of the advances that are noted in the book. Because I feel we've had a slightly weird period where the books and history have diverged because Agatha Christie's been deliberately not reflecting history. So it'll be interesting to see if this section of the podcast then ties back more closely into what's going on. And actually, I think with the next one with the Hollow, we will see that. I mean, we'll get that.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that although this has a feel with its setting and the sort of the cultural artifacts that people are talking about, of being like the late 20s, I do feel that there's still a feeling of progressive social change. Like you are, there seems to be much more open talk of affairs and people leaving each other through divorces and things like that than I think maybe there would have been when Christie started writing 20 years previously.
Yeah, definitely divorce has become well, if not socially totally accepted,
no.
certainly normalized. Yeah. Like it's not a complete pain in the ass to get one.
It seems to be easier to get one.
All right, then let's get into the characters of this novel, and let's start with the murder victim of the first dinner party in the Luxembourg restaurant, Rosemary Barton, wife of George Barton, very young, very pretty. She has personally inherited wealth from her godfather, who interestingly did not leave any to her younger sister. She's very pretty, was having an affair with someone called Leopard, who we then find out was the MP, Stephen Faraday, and was really willing to leave George for him. She's portrayed as maybe being rather dim, but kind of romantic with a capital R, sort of devil may care. She's willing to sort of throw it all away for love. Stephen Faraday says She was such a stupid woman, empty-headed, clinging, possessive, and she loved him still. That was the mischief of it.
He said she the face of an angel and the brains of a chicken. Like, oh God.
So mean. I mean, that reflects on him, right? But do you think it also reflects on
Yes.
Rosemary?
I do in a way, but I found her interesting to read because I do feel that Christie was exploring a character who we've seen before. So she reminded me of Arlene Marshall from Evil Under the Sun.
I agree.
She's this woman who wants to be loved and is pursuing this sort of this grand romantic ideal. The rest of the world can go hang. It made me wonder, how or how Christie saw these sorts of people, and I almost wonder as well if a bit of it wasn't Christie playing out her breakup of her first marriage with her husband, and if part of this wasn't a bit of wish fulfillment, and if Rosemary Barton wasn't almost like a character who was inspired by the second Mrs. Christie.
The other woman.
So, yeah.
Christie is rather dismissive of pretty young airheads, isn't she? Because
yes,
by this point she's 55, and we know she was very attractive as a young woman because she got many proposals. But, by this point she is, sadly, as we all sometimes are in our middle age and getting a little fatter. She loves her creamy cakes. And she's a bit more dowdy looking. And maybe there is a resentment of these young pretty things who can inherit great fortunes or marry into great fortunes just by being pretty. Where she's a working woman and she works bloody hard at making money through her craft. And she is a little bit patronizing about these. And, yes, Stephen Faraday saying it, how far is it, Christie? But there's something in it, isn't there? There's something in it.
I think like what I was getting from Rosemary Barton was that it's almost like this preferential treatment that she's had because she's been lucky enough to have had all this money from Uncle Paul. It's meant that she can be educated in Paris and she can debut. It's given her sort of a sense of entitlement, and that's given her a sort of a disconnect from reality. She's never had to mature really and face reality, and that sense of entitlement is really why she's got this devil-may-care attitude. It doesn't really come from a courage; it almost comes from an ignorance.
Oh, completely. Yeah. She's
know,
not one
and
of Christie's. Christie writes these bright young things, or she did more in the 20s and 30s, and they were courageous. But it was a courage that came of knowing what life was. Like if you look at Tommy and Tuppence, when we meet them, they're on their uppers. They have zero money, so they have to be adventurous and courageous and earn a living.
Yeah.
But this is like Rosemary Barton is definitely not in that category. I think the comparison there with Evil Under the Sun is a really brilliant one.
And I think the other thing I think is worth commenting on as well, because they mentioned this on your About Agatha podcast, is where she got the money from Uncle Paul from, and there was some talk of being an illegitimate child of Uncle Paul and her mother. And again, that I thought, that's a great insight. And I don't know whether Christie's intentionally written it in there, but it's definitely there to be read into. And I do like it. I like to think of Christie putting these little gems in there for people to pull up and doing it intentionally, because that would mean that she's got like a lot more craftsmanship as an author than maybe some people would credit her with. Like,
see, I always thought that was the case when I read it the first time, and I was surprised.
I never picked up on it. I had to have it explained to me, but it makes me think so much more of the depth to it.
But what surprises me is that if that is the case, then why is it that the little sister Iris, who obviously resents the fact that Uncle Paul's just given it all to Rosemary, why doesn't Iris think, oh, well, I guess maybe wouldn't Iris comment on it herself? Well, I suppose it makes sense if she was Mum's bastard child and.
Well, perhaps, but like, I think we can discuss this when we talk about Iris Maul because she was only 17.
Yeah,
maybe she's too young to have actually figured this out.
True. Anyway, so Rosemary is very rich in her own right, but then she's also married a very rich man. And she's married a new money city financier called George Barton, who is 15 years her senior. This is what Agatha Christie says about poor George when Rosemary agrees to marry him. That's why he had been so credulous, so dazed. Rosemary had said she was going to marry him. She wasn't in love with him, of course. He knew that quite well. In fact, she admitted as much. You do understand, don't you? I want to feel settled down and happy and safe. I shall with you. I'm so sick of being in love. It always goes wrong somehow and ends in a mess. I like you, George. You're nice and funny and sweet, and you think I'm wonderful. That's what I want. He had answered rather incoherently. Steady does it. We'll be as happy as kings. Oh, Poor George.
Well, I don't know, because like Rosemary's described as somebody who, again, like this Ollie Marshall character, who men will tire of, but George is just completely devoted to her. And he is not maybe being as fulfilled as he could be with somebody who actually loved him, but he seems to be happy in his ignorance. you know, he is devoted to this Rosemary Barton, this Venus, as far as he's concerned.
And he is a very, like, he's a bit like Kenneth Marshall in Evil Under the Sun. He's a very protective, chivalrous, sort of knight in shining armor figure. And if we're right that Rosemary was the illegitimate child of her mum's paramour, then maybe she was attracted to a kind of steadying father figure that she could attach herself to. I mean, I think there's something, there is something in that comparison, right? Yeah, in her own way. In her own way.
Yeah, she had a great deal of affection for him, but he was never going to be the grand romantic that she wanted. She was not he was not her ideal in that respect. But I mean, like, I don't know. I find it hard to judge George Barton. I wonder how he made his money. But like, he's made a choice and he's prepared to live with it, and he seemed happy. I mean, they do talk about it, like he understood that she would have affairs because he was never going to be exciting enough for her, but he always was on the understanding that she would come back to him, and he was happy with that. And
I think,
quite like that, because like we see this with the Faradays, but we see the flip side of it with the Faradays. And it does become a bit tired, doesn't it? Where you're always reading about how the man can just go charging off and have loads of affairs, and the woman is quite happily sitting at home, knowing that her husband will come back to her eventually. And you're like, oh, do we have to go through this all over again? And so I quite like seeing it flipped, But he is quite a tragic character in a way. You do feel a bit sad for him, because
I agree. But he's incredibly generous, right? I mean, so not only has he married Rosemary, he's taken in her little sister, Iris Mall, who is a teenage girl. She will inherit the wealth of Rosemary now that Rosemary's dead, and she can use it actively when she marries or turns 21. We get the impression in the opening chapters. So the structure of this novel is quite interesting. So the opening chapters are different people thinking back to the events of that tragic night and how they felt about Rosemary. So we only get to know her in retrospect, which is a really fascinating structural technique, and I think a very effective one.
Yeah, I agree.
And Iris, basically, we get the impression early on that she does love her sister, but she's also a bit jealous that she wasn't the one to inherit originally, and that, obviously Rosemary's been the one who's had all her mother's attention, because the mother died when Iris was quite young. So where Rosemary had the benefit of the debutante years and her mother's attention, Iris never got that, and so resents it. To quote, instead, through an open door, he saw Iris coming down the stairs. Iris, very straight and slim, with her pale face and black hair and grey eyes. Iris with much less than Rosemary's beauty, and with all the character that Rosemary would never have, words of Anthony Brown. But I think probably fairly accurate. I mean, she comes across as a pretty good kid. And yes, of course, with the natural jealousy one might have of a sister who's inherited millions, but basically quite decent, I think.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to what I was saying about you get the feeling that Rosemary, and that passage, I think, is what brought it home to me. Rosemary has this sense of entitlement because she's never been challenged in life. She's never had to work, and whereas Iris's upbringing was very different. She didn't get the same sort of advantages, and as a result, it's molded her, whereas Rosemary has largely been left, almost spoiled.
Yeah. So. And then George Barton's charity goes even wider than inviting in Iris Small, his sister-in-law. He also invites in Lucilla Drake, who was the maternal aunt to Rosemary and Iris, and who also will inherit if Iris ever dies, childless or unmarried, because she's sort of, again, a relation of theirs. But who's fallen on hard times. And this is maybe an indication of the sort of end of the war, that the previous sort of upper middle class have fallen on hard times with their investments. And so she's very grateful to have a place to live that's quite luxurious as a kind of chaperone to Iris, or a sort of stand-in mother figure. She's portrayed as being rather a silly figure. This is what Agatha Christie says. Lucilla Drake was twittering. That was the term always used in the family, and it was a really very apt description of the sounds that issued from Lucilla's kindly lips. She was concerned on this particular morning with many things, so many that she found it hard to pin her attention down to one at a time. So poor Aunt Lucilla. Do you think that's a bit mean? I mean, she is quite funny.
Yeah, I don't think we see a lot of her, really, and I think she is just an enabler, because the more important character, and who we really know that Lucilla was really thinking about, and really the only object of her attention at all times is her son Victor.
Absolutely. So let's get to the figures that don't live with the family but are on their periphery. And as you say, Victor Drake, son of Lucilla Drake, is very much always at the forefront of her mind. He is a man with desire to get money without work, the latest in a long line of feckless cads that Agatha writes, inspired by her big brother. He was, someone who disgraced the family, never held down a steady job, was always asking for money, and just ended up in a rather dissolute life, but for whom Agatha had a lot of fondness. So you get a lot of these sort of Victor Drake type characters who are wrong-uns. I suppose eagle-eyed reader might be thinking when you meet Victor, is she going to marry him off and reform him? So there's always that chance that some
always possibility
going to get lumbered with Victor Drake. Although this is a Colonel race novel, so there's no Papa Poirot. But really, he's quite a nasty bit of work.
It's hard not to have a bit of affection for him the way Agatha's written him. He almost comes across as almost like a Terry Thomas character for me. I can see him twiddling his moustache, and winking as he's telling you, "I'm really, really bad." And wink to camera and twiddle moustache.
Yeah, and I think, Agatha Christie loved rogues. I mean, her big brother was a rogue and she loved him. She married Archibald Christie, who I think was also a bit of a rogue and a ladies' man. And I think she does get that across. So you never know which way Victor's going to break. Is he really as bad as he's saying, or is he going to turn out to be actually all right under the surface?
Yeah.
So this is how we'd given a description of him and his interaction with Ruth Lessing, who we'll get to next. He looked at her laughing. She felt to have been revolted. But the strength of Victor Drake was the strength of the devil. He could make evil seem amusing. He was looking at her now with that uncanny penetration. So, this is a guy who's quite manipulative. I wrote in my notes that he reminded me of Iago from Othello, that he was just very manipulative. And we know that Agatha loves her Shakespeare, so I'm sure she was thinking of that too. But you're absolutely right that for Lucilla Drake, she can see no wrong. It's always someone else's fault that his jobs don't stick and he gets unjustly accused, and he's always trying to din her out of money.
The excuses she comes up with is she's deluding herself are hilarious. Because he was going to Oxford and he got expelled because he forged another student's signature on a check. And she's like, but he's got an artistic temperament. I'm sure he thought that was a great joke, and it was just a bit of fun. Like, he's a forger. Like, God.
I know. I mean, just so pathetic. But contrasted hugely in character and the strength of character, we think, with the other person who sits on the periphery of this family but is not part of it, which is Ruth Lessing. She is George Barton's devoted secretary, highly efficient, affects a very severe style of dress. So unlike Rosemary and all her frou-frou feminism, she wears very austere black and white, but very well cut and very modern. She's probably in love with George, one of a long line of secretaries in love with their bosses and Agatha Christie. She hates Rosemary, is very straightforward about that. And this is what Agatha Christie says of her. Every difficulty could always be smoothed out by Miss Lessing's capable fingers. Smiling, pleasant, aloof, she surmounted all obstacles. She ran George's office, and it was suspected ran George as well. He was devoted to her and leaned upon her judgment in every way. She seemed to have no needs, no desires of her own. So, again, a bit like Victor Drake. I mean, if Victor Drake's manipulating his mum, how far is Ruth Lessing manipulating George? And again, how did he make his money if he's so easily led by a pretty secretary? I don't know, but
I think you've actually you've hit the nail on the head there. I think Ruth has made George's money. That's how George is a tremendous success. And I think if this was a contemporary novel, if somebody was writing this and setting it in the 2020s, that would be the way round it was. Ruth would actually be the very successful person of business, and George would be this undersecretary running around doing all the bits and pieces. Because if this was a pure meritocracy, Ruth would be clearly the one on top. There's that bit in the book where we're being introduced to Ruth, and they're saying she ran his diary. She made sure that he met all the right people to be as effective as possible in business. And I think they even mentioned that she helped him pick the investments. So I'm almost reading it. When I was first introduced to George Barton, I was like, how has he got this money? He doesn't seem to be a particularly sharp individual. I think Agatha calls him a bit stupid on a few occasions. And then it's we're introduced to Ruth, and you're like, right, now the penny drops. He's probably inherited a load of money, and she's made more money for him. That's the way this has worked. So
excellent. Okay, so basically, barring Victor Drake, who's somewhere in the Argentine, probably hanging out with Colonel Captain Hastings somewhere. The other people mentioned so far, so the family, Lucinda Drake, and also Ruth Lessing, the secretary, were all at the fateful dinner at the Cafe Luxembourg. But some other people were also there who danced attendance on this family. So first of all, we have Anthony Brown, boyfriend of Rosemary, someone who was very attracted to her, but now that she's dead, seems to be even more attracted to Iris, who's working to solve, what actually is happening. But he's like a bit of a shady figure. For some reason, he seems to avoid coming to the house, doesn't seem to want to meet the family. Is he or isn't he registered with the American Embassy? So kind of very painted as a rather suspicious figure, but good looking, and transfers his allegiance from Rosemary to Iris. Any thoughts on Anthony Brown?
not that I would really want to discuss in any detail
Now.
outside of discussing him with Iris more before we get to the spoiler section. I very much saw the two of them together. And I think this is one of the things that I think is maybe making me not such a fan of this. Because again, we have this sort of age discrepancy. And I was reading at the Iris Mall sort of Anthony Brown, but I was almost thinking this is very reminiscent of Game of Thrones. We've got Sansa Stark here, this unexpected heiress becomes irresistible to an older gentleman as he transfers his affections
is
from
he the little
her
finger?
deceased relative. Yeah, money and title, of course, irrelevant. It's really love, isn't it, Littlefinger? Sorry, Anthony Brown, or should I say Tony Morelli, or whatever you're calling yourself this week. I feel a little bit uncomfortable, and I think again this is it translating it to a modern setting from then. But she's 17 and he's what, early 30s. I do think there's maybe.
Yeah, well, Mr. Darcy was 20 years older than Elizabeth Bennet. That's how they did it in those days. But I think you're right. It does jar for a modern reader. But I think part of that is deliberately. I think Agatha Christie's deliberately making him seem sketchy. She did. Yeah. So I think that feeling of awkwardness, even at the time for contemporary readers, I think was deliberately planted there by Agatha, which is why I think this is I think it's a good book. Maybe I think it's a better book than I said at the start. I think I love the structure of it at the start, where you're building up a picture, Rashomon style, of what Rosemary was like from all these different people who had interactions with her.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that's very effective, and I don't think it's a technique Christie's used a lot in previous books, and she does do it very effectively in this.
She does it with events in Five Little Pigs, but doing it with a character here is a sort of twist on that. And I think the Anthony Brown sort of the sketchiness, intended and unintended, and is it contemporary or is it anachronistic for us reading it now? I think that's her being quite clever too. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt on Anthony Brown. And then we have our final two characters who are at dinner and who are major in this novel. We have Leopard, who we very quickly discover is actually Stephen Faraday, rising member of Parliament, who actually, if there's a little thing, I would argue it's more him. Little Stephen Faraday, this is a quote from Agatha Christie, had steadfastly cultivated his will with a capital W. He could look for little help in life save that which he got by his own efforts. A small, pale boy of 7 with a good forehead and a determined chin, he meant to rise and rise high. His parents, he already knew, would be of no use to him. His mother had married beneath her status in life and regretted it. His father, a small builder, shrewd, cunning, and cheese-paring, was despised by his wife and also by his son. For his mother, vague, aimless, and given to extraordinary variations of mood, Stephen felt only a puzzled incomprehension until the day he found her slumped down on the corner of a table with an empty eau de cologne bottle fallen from her hand. It's actually rather a tragic story, isn't it? Being raised by an alcoholic mother and a father that both kid and mother unfairly hold in contempt. But what we then learn is that he's basically been very opportunistic. He's chosen which party to become a member of by that which will give him the most opportunity, not from his principles. And he has also made a political marriage to the rather plain daughter of a very powerful political family that can further his career. So this is a man on the up, a man who intends to go very far in life, and for whom, yes, there might be a love affair, but he's not going to let that derail his ambitions. Thoughts on Stephen Faraday, Pat?
I think yes, you could think he's a Littlefinger character, but I do think he has a redemption arc, unlike Littlefinger. So,
spoilers for Game of Thrones.
Yeah. I mean, unlike Littlefinger, he finds out that he actually loves his Lysa Arryn rather than throws her off for somebody younger. So yeah, I mean, I think they have a very interesting relationship, and it's not the type of relationship I enjoy reading loads about. I think again on the All About Agatha podcast, they talked about this being reminiscent of Anthony Trollope novels and talking about the relationships in there. And I didn't find it the most engaging part of the book, but I can understand why some people would enjoy it. I think maybe that's one of the reasons why for me this is just mid-tier. It doesn't elevate it, but I did think there was something very reassuring about the way this couple come to this accommodation about how they understand how they love each other after time. And they almost have to have their love tested. It's a reflection of how times have changed in a way, in that you get the feeling that when he starts his affair, he is almost only staying in the marriage because he is worried about the social stigma and how it will affect his political career. But as he gets more time as he spends more time in the relationship, he actually comes to value his wife more and realize why he loves her and why he wants to stay in the relationship. And I suppose part of it in that respect, it's him growing up, even though he's an adult, he's maturing.
I think there's something into the idea that Agatha Christie's also matured in her concept of marriage too. I think in her early novels, she had bad marriages and good marriages. Whereas in the latest few novels, Evil Under the Sun included, and certainly in The Hollow, you have marriages that are more complicated than that are accommodations, but that work, and where people can fall in and out of love within that marriage. And that's okay, it will survive that shifting of power in a way. And I think
people evolve. They evolve emotionally as they get older.
I always feel that for those that view Sparkling Cyanide as top tier, and I think it's bottom of top tier, if that makes sense. I think I rate it higher than you. I think it's for its technical construction, but it's also for the characters, and not so much the characters, but the really mature, honest way in which he depicts the messiness of relationships, and that you shouldn't judge from the outside as, is this a good or bad marriage? It's a marriage that works for the people within it. Like George Barton can be happy in a situation that we think is maybe not ideal, humiliating even, but if it works for him, that's okay. And I think that thinking of Agatha Christie at 55 with a husband who's in his 40s and she's the breadwinner, I'm sure many people passed comments and derisive comments when they got together. But if it works for them, I think she's making an argument that if it works for the couple, what business is it of yours? And I really kind of like that. I think there's a maturity in depicting relationships in these novels of the 40s that we didn't really have in the novels of the 20s and the early 30s.
It's difficult to disagree with that. And I think those are all valid points. And again, like I'm only speaking subjectively, and it's not something that I find engaging and entertaining to read. But I know a lot of people.
That's fair enough.
That would be the difference between me making it top tier and calling it mid tier. It's just again we come back to like Blue Train, which the All About Agatha podcast was quite snippy about, or even Death on the Nile, which I think everybody loves. And I just like those when they're faster and breezier and more flippant, and and they have Poirot. Whereas this, it's a little bit more. It's got a little bit more sort of gravity to it, which is not a bad thing, and and I don't mind it. And certainly, like in Evil Under the Sun, I was caught off guard, and that's what got me with that. Whereas with this one, it just trots along. But like this has got a lot of stuff to commend it. Like I was thinking about this in contrast with Appointment with Death, because I found the first third of Appointment with Death very difficult to get through. Just because it was quite slow, and the characters didn't grab me. Whereas this one would drop straight into the action, and like you said, we're sort of remembering back, and that's a really effective device. Like I was engaged straight away in this. It's a good book in that respect.
Well, let's do our final character, who's arguably one of the most fascinating, which is the wife of Stephen Faraday, Leopard, Alexandra Faraday, his rather plain wife, but from a prestigious noble family, who's married him, fallen desperately in love with him, and is almost described as having a medieval devotion to him. This is how she's described in the book when we first meet her. That was Lady Alexandra Hale standing there, and with the unerring perception of a shy person, Stephen knew that she too was shy. The plainest of the 5 daughters, Alexandra had always suffered under a sense of inferiority. Given the same education and upbringing as her sisters, she had never quite attained their savoir-faire, which annoyed her mother considerably. Sandra must make an effort. It was absurd to appear so awkward, so gauche. And I guess in that first meeting, then there is a hint that they are compatible, because actually Stephen is very sympathetic to her. They are the same character type, even though he's masking it with all his political ambition. And then this is the description of the marriage, which is very, like you say, it's a wonderful kind of inverted symmetry to Barton and Rosemary. From the day of their marriage, she had realized that he did not love her in the same way as she loved him, but she thought it possible that he was actually incapable of such a love. That power of loving was her own unhappy heritage. To care with a desperation and intensity that was, she knew, unusual among women. She would have died for him willingly. She was ready to lie for him, scheme for him, suffer for him. So yeah, it is that same thing where one of them, it's kind of like the phrase in Death of the Nile when Poirot sees Jackie in the restaurant with her Simon Doyle and says, one who loves and one who lets himself be loved. You know, these love imbalances in Christie, I think, are really well observed. And as you say, maybe come from her first marriage. But I think just an incredibly mature depiction of two marriages that are that kind of work, but probably shouldn't from the outside.
Yeah, that people might be judgmental about, but really, like, if they're working, like, who are we to criticize?
Indeed. Okay, so that's the character setup. So as we know in the plot, we had the dinner party a year ago in the restaurant. Poor Rosemary seemed to commit suicide. They all took a toast of champagne, and she apparently keeled over with cyanide poisoning from that. They assume she's poisoned her own champagne. Dinner party is arranged again in the same restaurant a year later, where George Barton hopes to expose one of the people present as a murderer because he has been receiving poison pen letters saying that his wife was actually murdered, and has been incredibly distracted ever since. And everyone observes that something's not right with him. He must really have loved her, because this absolutely fells him, doesn't it? Just knowing that she was murdered and didn't commit suicide. So that's the plot setup, and we'll get back into the plot after the end credits music. How did you feel this book read? I mean, you talked a bit about the anachronism and the weirdness of the age gaps. Does it come across, we've had horrific stuff in previous Christies, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia. On the balance of progressive versus regressive, how did this read in general to you?
I think it was of its time. I don't think, we've got away from a lot of other stuff because certain types of characters, like people with Jewish noses aren't introduced. But there was one bit where she's talking, or they're interviewing an Italian waiter, and I did feel that was maybe a bit harsh, because he gets described as monkey-like. I'm like, well, do we like describing people now if we're writing something effectively as monkey-like? I mean,
that's clearly racist, right? I mean, it's just horrible.
Yeah, I thought that was a bit unpleasant, but I mean, apart from that, I didn't think it was too bad. But
it's definitely not as bad as the novels of the 20s and 30s. There are, like you say, there are a few things where you go, I think that's definitely one of them. I think that Leopard, and so the nicknames.
Yes.
But he is Leopard and she is his Ethiopian/Black Beauty.
Yeah.
And then when they go to the Luxembourg, which is really the Café de Paris, which is basically a restaurant, but also has a bandstand and an area for dancing, there's obviously a jazz band on, and it's called, quote unquote, one of those Negro shows. And you just think, But that was of its time. And it's interesting, in this final few episodes of The Crown, there is a recreation of Princess Elizabeth and her sister sneaking out to the Ritz to go and see, quote unquote, one of those Negro shows. And there's real discomfort at the idea that Princess Elizabeth might be, oh my goodness, dancing to jazz with a Black US officer, heaven forfend. And I think some of the critiques of the show have said, how far is this Peter Morgan telling us how weird racial attitudes were in 1945 versus him kind of being awkward about it even now? Like, it's a little bit questionable, but certainly that's part of it. There's also a character called Mr. Pedro Morales, who is present in the restaurant at the second dinner. And he's described as a nasty bit of goods from Mexico. Even the whites of his eyes are yellow. And I'm just like, that's not good.
But I mean, it is. I don't think that's like an aspersion on Pedro. I think that's an aspersion. I don't think that's an aspersion on Mexicans. It's an aspersion on Pedro, who spoke a variant of the American language, which I thought was quite funny.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, is it anti-American the way she has American speaking? But we'll get into that in the spoiler film section. But there are some other things which I think are quite interesting. Like, at some point, people talk about bad blood, like, can you inherit bad behavior?
Hmm.
Quote, bad blood, you see. I didn't listen to Lucinda Drake for nothing. I know all about the Marl family. Victor Drake, not so much weak as positively evil. His mother, feeble in intellect and incapable of concentration. Hector Marl, weak, vicious, and a drunkard. Rosemary, emotionally unstable. A family history of weakness, vice, and instability. And, like, I'm not saying that Agatha believes that. Of course not. She's satirizing a character who's very prejudiced, but I think that probably was very of its time, the idea that you would have inherited weakness and feebleness. It's kind of very victim shaming, like if someone has alcoholism or mental health issues, right? I mean, that is very of its time. As well as, is depression after influenza a thing? Like, everyone assumes she's committed suicide because she got flu and then got depressed afterwards.
Yeah.
Was that a real thing? I don't know, but if that feels weird, but I guess it was.
I think that might have been it might have been more that Agatha can just write that and nobody's going to challenge it, because at the time maybe people weren't as clued up. You know, like, you don't have the internet to hand. We're not all self-diagnosing doctors now because we can just Google our symptoms.
Yeah,
So,
go to NHS Direct and see what's going on.
yeah, I'm often thinking about this now. You know, I think back to when I was a kid growing up, and like the doctor just came out and just prescribed penicillin. What have you got? I've cut my leg. Here, have some penicillin. What have you got? Sore throat. Here, have some penicillin. Yeah, a shot of penicillin will cure that. Yeah, headache. Yeah, a shot of penicillin. Whatever the problem was, that was always the cure. You know, whereas like now they're much more focused on certain things. So, you know, I can understand some people may feel depressed after they've had the flu. Like, they probably do feel rotten, you know, like and yeah, I can see how people would associate the two together. But I think part of that was just Agatha was saying, right, we need to write in why she committed suicide. So she had a bit of flu and she felt a bit bad about it. And is it medically justified? Well, I don't know, but I felt a bit bad after I had my last flu, so I'll just put that in. And nobody's going to challenge her on it, you know.
And I think people often in modern world, I mean, maybe COVID's corrected this, we forget that proper flu is very different from having a cold, and even a miserable cold. I mean, proper flu is genuinely debilitating.
Yeah, and you will never experience man flu, Bina, as well, which is also really, really debilitating.
I don't know. Like, my dad's a proper hypochondriac, and I do lean into my illness, as my husband will tell you. I'm very hardy and robust. I'm very ready, but when I do, I really milk it. And even if it's mild, I'm just like, I'm so pathetic and incapable and just needing ministering to. It's actually really, it's one of my very worst traits. It's just how ridiculous I am when I am ill. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to say penultimate thing I want to say is Colonel Race, who is definitely a weakness in this book. He's definitely a throwback. He's one of Agatha Christie's bronze, tan, tall colonial administrators that she was desperately in love with in her 1920s novels, and then starts to kind of satirize a little bit in the 1930s. I think Murder at the Orient Express, Colonel Arbuthnot, she starts to see there's a little bit. And when we get to this book, 1945, he's definitely seen as a quote-unquote empire builder. He's 60 years old. He's definitely a throwback. And Agatha writes of him, Colonel Race was not good at small talk and might indeed have posed as the model of a strong, silent man, so beloved by an earlier generation of novelists. So I think she herself is taking the piss out of how much she was in love with these characters in the 20s. And I'm thinking in particular of that really dodgy bits of Man in the Brown Suit where she's like, you know, she always seems to want a strong, silent, ugh man to sweep her off her feet and sort of, you know, whatever, have his way with her. But Colonel Race has more to him. Someone says to him, women don't play cricket, he said, if that's what you mean. And then Race responds, actually, a lot of them do, said Race, smiling. But I'm glad to see you look uncomfortable. And I was like, as a woman who likes cricket, I was like, good for you, Colonel Race. A lot of women play cricket.
Yeah, I play quite well.
Yeah, there you go. So I was just like, see, Colonel Race, not such a stick in the mud. Don't underestimate him. And the final thing I wanted to say, maybe this is more about historical context. We get a lot of information via Iris and Rosemary about what female education is in this period. And this is the 1940s, and it is posh girls, right? This isn't all girls.
Yeah,
but
I don't think this is the 40s, though, is it? Like, this really is. Well, the 20s, yeah, because I think the Depression maybe changed that, and I think we see this in how Agatha is writing. Like, if you look at her novels from like the 20s and the 30s, you do see a change. And it was very much like the Blue Train.
She's getting domestic education classes, languages, finishing school, debutante season, and marriage. I mean, isn't that very much what you read biographies of Camilla Parker Bowles, and that's basically what she had: boarding school, domestic education, finishing school in Paris, debutante season, then marriage.
Yeah, well, perhaps this is right. I mean, I've not read Camilla Parker Bowles' biography. I'm just, I just,
Princess
I
Anne
think
very much went through this. I mean, there's
never,
not,
never read her biography either. But I would just, I think like Agatha's writing this just during the war years, and
Yeah.
I don't see finishing school in Paris happening when it's being occupied by the Germans. So I'm not so yeah, maybe they picked up on it. I don't know when the people would have started going back to finishing school in Paris after 1945, what year that happened. But I don't think they still do it. But like,
Oh, they
what
do, my
time?
friend. They very much do. I know people are going
Okay.
into finishing school in Switzerland and Paris. And what I would say is, I went to, admittedly on a full scholarship, let me make this very clear. I went to a relatively posh day/boarding school for girls in the 80s. And we had domestic science classes, and we were taught how to make nutritious meals and change baby's nappy, because although we may well go to university, we were very much going to find a husband and get married.
I did not. Can I just make this clear on the pod? I did not go to any sort of boarding school, and it wasn't posh. But I also had domestic science classes in school.
I'm pleased. So can you change your baby's nappy then? What were you taught as boys? Was it the same as the girls? Was it a mixed school?
It was a mixed school, and I was taught with the girls. We were taught how to burn cakes.
Very good.
And fry eggs and do other bits and pieces. So I'm surprised people are still doing this. I mean, I can understand how, like, I don't know. I can understand how some people are still doing it, but like not the swathes of the middle class.
No, this is a very, very, very limited section of society. Even then, I would imagine. Anyway, I just thought it was really funny reading that and thinking, oh my word.
Yeah, well, maybe what I'm thinking about is like Agatha's writing books about this slice of society, and maybe it's just that we don't have books that are written by best-selling authors about this slice of society now. Maybe in that respect, it's of its time in that, you know, people are now reading biographies about these people rather than
novels.
Books of fiction. So.
Yeah, true. Okay, well, let's get to the adaptations. So there are two big ones. There's the 1983 very American one. It's CBS writers, and it's a televised film set in modern day California, or 1983 California. It stars Anthony Andrews as Tony Brown, Pamela Bellwood as Ruth Lessing. So if you ever watch Dynasty, that's Claudia Blaisdell from Dynasty, which gave me endless joy and gorgeousness. Nancy Marchand plays Lucilla Drake, known to Sopranos fans as Livia Soprano, much younger version. So yeah, lots of famous people in there. It does not feature Colonel Race, which is good. And the hero is very much the Anthony Andrews character. So he's doing this basically at peak post Brideshead Revisited fame, and he's very tan and very good looking. And it's like watching an episode of Dynasty. It's very glitzy and gorgeous and glamorous, and it's just absurd. Like, it doesn't feel like an Agatha Christie, but it just very much tells you what would have been cool and aspirational in 1983. So insofar as it still fulfills its role as telling you something about the time and what people wanted to look like in those times, it still works. Have you seen this one?
No, I haven't. I am intrigued though, so it's another one of these I'll put on my long list of things to try and watch.
You can watch it if you put it in YouTube. You can get the full movie, not in great quality, and that's how I watched it. It's just hilariously fun. And I'm an aficionado of like Dallas and Dynasty and those 80s soaps. So I will occasionally do like a full rewatch of Dynasty. So it very much is up my street. Apparently, as I said before, and you've seen it, there's the Yellow Iris adaptation in the Agatha Christie's Poirot David Suchet series that I actually haven't watched. Is it worth watching from memory? Is it worth?
Yes, I enjoyed it.
Cool, I will do so. And in late 2003, it was loosely adapted by Laura Lampson for ITV. And again, they get rid of Colonel Race. They again make it contemporary. So this tells you a lot about early 2000s Britain. It also tells you about the fact that ITV had an incredibly successful kind of soapy, campy drama called Footballers' Wives on. And this is almost in that universe. So George Barton becomes a very rich football manager and his wife's murdered. And rather than having Colonel Race, they kind of bring in kind of like a Tommy and Tuppence style middle-aged sleuthing pair. And again, it's got a good cast, right? So Pauline Collins plays the woman in that sleuthing pair. You've got a young Colin Firth's kid brother in there as Victor Drake. You've got a very young Dominic Cooper before he became famous and then has become not famous ever since. What happened to him? But I have to say, I really do not like this version. I think it's really drab, really low budget, really boring. I found it very, very hard to get through it. So I would definitely not recommend that one. Have you seen it?
I've not seen it, but I'm really disappointed to hear that, because I thought Footballers' Wives was the sort of spiritual successor to Dallas and Dynasty
Yes.
from the 90s. You know, it's our UK version of Dallas and Dynasty in the 90s, but there you go.
Sort of Real Housewives before we had Real Housewives. It was just marvelously stupid. Someone needs to reboot that and bring it back. Surely, with all the popularity of like Ted Lasso and Welcome to Wrexham, there's got to be room in the schedules for a Footballers' Wives remake.
Yeah, and footballers are now even more wealthy than oil barons, so it's
exactly.
Yeah, we can have even more lavish excess. So
right, okay. Well, we can wrap things up unless there's anything else you want to say in the pre-spoiler bit.
No, I think we've covered everything.
Right, and we'll be coming back now with 2 back-to-back Poirots, The Hollow and Taken at the Flood, which may potentially be mini pods, even though they're Poirots. And then the big one that we're building to, which I think is the next for sure Full House podcast, is Crooked House. And I'm hoping to get Hannah on that because I know it's her favourite, or one of her top 3 favourite Christies. It's also one of my top 3 favourite Christies. I think it's just universally adored. And I think that should for sure be a full pod. But the next one we'll be covering is The Hollow, potentially as a mini pod, if you're following along at home. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. And we'll see you after a little bit of a Christmas and New Year's break. Hope you have a wonderful turn of the year, wherever you are. Okay, everyone, this section of the podcast is definitely going to be filled with spoilers, for sure for Sparkling Cyanide, maybe for some other novels as well. So do not go on if you don't want to be spoiled. The solution of Sparkling Cyanide is that the first murder was intentional. It was not suicide, but the second murder was the wrong victim. George Barton was not the intended victim. The intended victim was Iris Maule. And when you realise that the victims were Rosemary and Iris, you then realise that the motive was money, not sexual jealousy. Because if Iris is also dead, Lucille inherits the money and she will be putty in the hands of her son, Victor Drake. So it's actually Victor Drake who is the mastermind, the Iago behind this murder. His partner in crime was Ruth Lessing, who hated Rosemary, who feels very downtrodden, very overlooked by George Barton, and is persuaded to take part in this ruse.
That's where your Iago comparison actually bears fruit, because Victor does very little in this. He just
lazy,
manipulates. Yeah,
he
manipulates
doesn't do anything for money. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he enjoys talking to people and suggesting ideas to them. You know, they're probably thinking about themselves already.
Exactly.
And Ruth does everything basically, you know, and not even because Victor's encouraging her. He's just like putting suggestions in there, you know, just pushing the buttons.
Yeah, and the solution that it's these two is laid out in those opening chapters, because he tells us who he is, and she tells us she dislikes Rosemary. She tells us that he spoke to her, and she felt evil being stirred up inside her. So that, but at that point, it's then what is the mechanics and what is the motive, and how is this playing out?
This reminded me of Evil Under the Sun, because we have the Red Ferns, and again it came back to me to Death in the Nile, because again we've got Jackie and Simon. Again, you know, we've got a woman being drawn into a relationship with a man who is basically lazy and wants money, you know, and the woman is the brains of the operation and is making everything happen. She's the one who's basically having to carry out the stuff to make the relationship work. And what I liked about this novel, it gave an extra dimension to those relationships that we didn't get to see in Death in the Nile and Evil Under the Sun, is that you see the charm of Victor Drake. You know, we're sitting here and it's being explained to us. Ruth is explaining to us how she knows everything that she's hearing is wrong. But this guy is actually very charming and she enjoys his company. And you're thinking, right, it's being explained to us now how these Terry Thomas characters get away with it. Because we're looking at them going, God, he's just so bad. Why are you doing it? And so, well, his smile was quite disarming as he sat there and told me how bad he was, you know, and he had the charm of the devil. You know,
exactly.
I thought it was quite good. The most interesting, I felt maybe Agatha had failed with me, because I was actually rooting for the bad guys in this. I thought Victor and Ruth, good on you.
You fell for his charm. And it's meritocracy, isn't it? I remember once writing an entire essay on Othello. This is when I was in school, arguing that when you read the Iago monologues, he's basically making a powerful argument for meritocracy. He's saying, I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm clever and I want what I want, and I'm countering people who are entitled and who have privilege and who don't deserve it. And you also get that a little bit in King Lear with the evil bastard, son who's going to manipulate everyone. They are often in Shakespeare, you have these quite demented meritocrats who turn into, that you do kind of root for because you see what they're fighting against, right? And the system is rigged. It's like, don't hate the player, hate the game. So I do get that. I think the comparison with Death on the Nile is absolutely spot on. Rosemary is the Lynette Doyle who's beautiful and everybody envies her for various reasons. And you get that set up in the opening chapters. And absolutely Jackie is the brains, she's the efficient one, and sort of Victor is the sort of the Simon. But if there's a flaw in Death on the Nile is you understand that Jackie's passionately in love with Simon, but you never understand why, because he is this lazy, charming lughead. I mean, it's looks, but there's not much there beyond that. We never see him be charming and even Lynette Doyle, this incredibly worldly, sophisticated, intelligent woman. Where does she fall for Simon other than just Jackie's got something, a shiny toy and I want it because I have everything. Whereas I think here you're right, that the Victor character is so well essayed. And to me, again, that's a progression of Agatha Christie's writing style and skill. So she may by this point be reusing plots and reusing tropes like love triangle or whatever. But I think you just see how I think she's evolving them. I mean, I think this is an exceptionally well-written book. We can get into the plot mechanics and credibility, but as character, as situation, as motivation to make you fall in love with a character who's basically stone cold evil psychopath. I think she's really progressed in her writing. And a lot of people accuse her of, doing these safe country house mysteries with stock characters that aren't very well sketched out. And I think we've done a number of novels now, but this is certainly one where I think the characters are all incredibly credible. I mean, I think, and really fascinating. So
yeah, they're very well rounded and evolved characters.
And even where they are a bit caricatural, like Race, she kind of mocks herself and says, well, young novelists fall in love with those characters. But then she still has a little twist on Race. Let's get into the plot mechanics and the clues. The first clue for me, because actually this is one that I figured out even the first time I read it. If Race was at the restaurant and no one else knew, why couldn't someone else be at the restaurant and no one else knows? So soon as Colonel Race reveals to George Barton that he was at the restaurant, then you kind of think, okay, well, who else was? We get told, and it's a very throwaway detail, but significant, because we know she's so efficient, that Ruth sacked the telephone girl. And you're like, well, why? Because in those days, if she was supposedly putting calls through to the Argentine, the telephone girl at the exchange, and this is, again, a bit of social history, would have been plugging in the wires and making the call. So she had to sack her because she would have been the evidence that she wasn't making those overseas calls. You get, of course, the handbag placed back on the table by the young waiter who's in a rush. And we can get into whether that's credible. The empty powder paper in Iris's purse, just as in Rosemary's. So we know that when Rosemary died, one of the reasons they realized or think she committed suicide is because she has the empty paper with the cyanide powder in her purse. And we also know that that was found in Iris's purse, which is why at some point they suspect Iris and basically being the murderer. But that is the first indication that she should have been the victim, not George. And once you realize she's the intended victim, then it comes down to, okay, who inherits next? Who needs money? Oh, yeah, it's Lucinda and Victor. So I think that's the kind of the logic path down which I discovered who did it. And then the final one for me is that you do not drink your own health. Well, these days, I think you do drink your own health. But anyway, in those days, Agatha's very clear that you don't drink your own health.
If you're looking... with champagne on the table, I drink my own health twice.
No champagne left untouched. But if someone's got to have a drink that was fine when the poor Italian waiter poured and at toast, but then wasn't fine after the dancing. And so that also leads you to Iris. And then for all Agatha Christie lovers, we find out that Victor Drake had at one point been an actor. So that should give you a klaxon. And then you realise that the really bad writing, the Agatha Christie writing American characters really badly, is deliberate, and that it's a bad acting performance with lots of American slang, and the jazz just didn't swing.
Yes. Yeah, they run through those all in the All About Agatha podcast.
Yeah, and, exactly.
Like they're sort of partly offended because the American is so bad.
No, but, I think you can be. I mean, when I was doing my progressive regressive, I almost put it in, but then I thought actually it's a deliberate misdirect. So
yeah, I think it is a deliberate misdirect. I didn't get this until it was explained at the end, and I think the reason that I didn't get this was because of the misdirects. So
they're good.
Yeah, well, and almost borderline. I feel like I'm not going to say she cheated me, but like she did sell me, because we're told that Ruth Lessing is devoted to George, very early on. But we
Mm.
like looking back on it, we're told that before she meets Victor Drake. That's that and so I suppose she's playing fair in that respect. But I think to get this, you have to realise that it is about the money and that Iris was the target. And once you've clicked that, the motivations then become clear. But until that point, I think you're always susceptible to being misdirected, particularly when they go into that much depth about Stephen Faraday and Sandra's marriage.
And they lay it on really thick that she will do anything for him, even murder for him.
Yeah.
Even her own parents think she's done something stupid.
Particularly as well when they're talking and you're inside Stephen's head and he's talking about how he can't lose his wife and he can't lose his political career, how these things have become so important to him. There are plenty of misdirects in there that meant I had no idea that Victor Drake wasn't in the Argentine until it was explained to me at the end.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part, because the only way you can truly know that is if you take seriously that opening chapter when Ruth says she feels evil stirring up in her. I think it's almost too obvious, because at that point I'm like, well, Ruth and Victor have done it. Now I just need to figure out why. And then I picked up on the telephone girl. But if you don't take that to heart, because it's so flipping obvious, it's almost like it's hiding in plain sight. That opening meeting of Victor and Ruth is really like an in plain sight. And it's on like page 10 or something. It's like it's really, really obvious. So if you disregard that, as you should, because you're a cynical Agatha Christie reader, then I think it's very hard to find.
I'm still kicking myself that I missed the actor Claxon.
Yeah.
Sitting down and I've been everything, an actor, and I'm like, God, why didn't I get that? He obviously did it. He's been an actor. So
it's the same when you get the hokey sort of American accent. But the only bit of it, I mean, I find the plot mechanics all good, and it's a good plot. And I find the motivation good, and everything makes sense. I totally believe smart women can fall for a manipulative guy. I think, or vice versa. I think that's very plausible. The only bit I don't get is that, and I do this a lot, right? I always have a stupid little bag that's on a table, like it's knocked about when I go dancing, and then come back, because this is how Indian weddings work. And a waiter puts it back when he's cleared the tables of all the food while you were out doing your Indian dancing, and you come back. If my bag was on the wrong chair, or my because sometimes they fold the napkin and put it back, you always know I'd be like, oh, they put it in the wrong thing, and then I'd sit in my original chair and put my handbag back. I wouldn't just sit because my handbag was there. That's the bit that I find really
this must have been a round table, a circular
that's
table.
Fine. So I'm thinking every Indian wedding I ever go to is a round table of 10 people. So I've practiced this many times.
This one must have had 7, so it's not like for like, and these chairs must have been identical. I mean, okay, I don't know how many Indian weddings you've been to at an establishment like Café du Paris, where they've got
no, they're always in
Italian waiters,
banqueting halls on the edge of Birmingham or Bolton, right?
I think you'll probably find the attention to detail in the Café du Paris probably means that you could just be fooled. You've got to put it in its setting. I don't think you're being fair here, it's not like for like. So
I think I'm going to speak to all the girls listening to this podcast. You have stupid little purses that you put on the table when you go to a dinner. If that's put back in the wrong place, or if a napkin's put back in the wrong place, would you sit down, write it, and tell us? Because I think the girls are going to be with me on this. You don't just sit where the purse is. That's just not how girls work.
But I
I'm going to speak for all womankind now.
No, I think this is like a lot of Christie's for me. I give her a pass on this. Like, she's constructed everything else so well, and it is just a minor detail. And I don't get hung up on this technicality. I do understand why people who read these as puzzle books do, but I read them, mostly for the story. So I'm not sitting down here trying to figure out who did it. That's an aside, and if the rest of the story hangs together well, then it's fine. It's great. And this one did, but my biggest problem with it, was just the Anthony Brown, Tony Morelli character. I just found his relationship with Iris a bit creepy, and then the way that it pivots in the last quarter, where suddenly he becomes the detective and figures everything out, and
so why did you even need Colonel Race at that point?
Exactly, and I just thought, is this Christie trying to introduce a new young detective? Because if Race is 60, Poirot must be 80, and she's decided that they need to be phased out, and we've got to have somebody younger and more dynamic. And is this going to be the first of a series of Tony Morelli novels? I don't know, but it's the sort of thing that was going through my head when I was like, why isn't Poirot in this? And why have we got Johnny Race? And why why Tony Morelli has had to do all this work at the end to try and figure it out. It just felt a little bit incongruous towards the end. It threw me off in that respect. But I think your criticism about the purse on the table, like they mentioned that in the All About Agatha podcast, as well as being a real plot problem from the technical construction of it. So I think it's a valid criticism. I would say the first 2/3 of this book are very good. It's just sort of it tailed off towards the end, which is why it's mid-tier for me. So am I going to be spoiling Yellow Iris for you if I talk about...
No, you go ahead. I mean, I'm going to watch it anyway, so, but I don't mind like hearing the comparison.
Yeah, because George Barton is the murderer in there, and it's because he's frittered away all the money. So like it's interesting that they put the twist on it slightly differently. I liked it more as a story because it was just a lot tighter, but the characterization wasn't as good as this one. And I do think maybe the strongest part of this is for me, it is the insight that we get into Ruth and Victor, and their relationship. The Sandra Stevens stuff was nice, but that's the sort of high point of this one, and what sets it apart from the other Christies for me was the Victor and Ruth.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's maybe come back and talk about Yellow Iris when I've watched it and read it, because I think it will be a very interesting comparison to get into. And we will reconvene next time, or at least I will, for The Hollow. I think we're going to have a bit of a break over the Christmas New Year period, maybe not get Agatha Christie'd out, revitalize our juices for the reread. And we'll let you know, reader, how we approach the next couple of books. But as I said before, Crooked House will be the next big full cast reread, hopefully. And with that, thank you all very much for listening, and thank you, Pat, for joining me.
Thanks again for hosting, Bina. Have a great Christmas.
You too. Okay, bye everyone.
Okay, bye.
Pat.